Thanks for tuning into Season 3 of the Forward Podcast, a resource brought to you by MeadowBrook Church. In this season, we're exploring the eternal focus of having engagement in our community and around the world. I'm Daniel Doak, your host for this season, and I'm joined by Mike Nemi, our missions pastor. Today, episode 7, we're talking about understanding culture and worldview, and why it's good to have an understanding of who you're engaging and how you should best connect with them when you're serving in missions. Well, Mike, I thought about a specific situation coming into today's episode that I think really ties into this. I remember this past August, I got to go to Uganda, and I've learned just over the years going on mission trips that, hey, you're going to always be surprised by cultural, even when you think you start to understand the cultures, there'll be things that pop out to you. I remember driving across a bridge that was going over the Nile, thought it was an amazing setup, was going to take a picture of it. And I pulled my phone out and really quickly learned you can't take pictures of bridges in Uganda. Now, thankfully, the police didn't see me. It was not a big deal. But of all things, I just little things like that just jump out to you to where you're like, man, it's illegal to take pictures of bridges there for some reason. Yeah. So things like that is kind of a weird example, but it ties into understanding culture and then the worldview that people are seeing, the lens that people are seeing the world through when they just live every day in their communities.
Yeah, because when we're thinking about, hey, we want to engage people from different cultures and backgrounds with the gospel, we don't want to come off as this domineering American who's got it all figured out because we're the best culture out there, right? We're the best country, the best culture out there, and they're doing it wrong because they do it differently than we do. And so we don't want to have that attitude as we're bringing the gospel to people. We want to come humble. We want to come as learners. We don't come as know-it-alls. And so things like that are always going to pop up of, well, why did they do that? Like, to us, you think, it's just a bridge. Like, why in the world would they not want people to take pictures of bridges? That's dumb.
Yeah.
Right? So, did you ever find the answer?
I did find out. Apparently, they don't have many bridges there, and so they're concerned if someone takes bridges and they were to attack.
Yep.
They lose their infrastructure.
I figured that would be the answer because just in Uganda, as you know, like in most places around the world, they don't want you taking pictures of police officers or military or targets that they are perceived targets, and so those are a lot of reasons, right? And so I think, culture, worldview, it's a good topic for us to talk about when we're thinking about missions and taking the gospel to different people groups around the world, because all over the world, they do things differently than we do. Yeah.
Well, and I think, obviously, I think anybody was traveling to Uganda or Argentina or anywhere in the world, you'd think, hey, the culture is different. Yeah. Their perspective of life is different. But, this applies just as much in local missions as well. I know my first mission trip I ever went on was to Delaware. I was in high school, and they were amazed that these kids from Alabama had shoes on. Yeah. And so, it's funny to joke about, but it does give you a little bit of picture of who they think they're interacting with. And that applies to any situation you're in, whether it's down the street, across town, or around the world. Well,
I'm from California. And so, which I always am quick to tell people, because I've been in the South for a long time now, but I'm quick to tell them I'm a naturalized Southerner, even though I'm born and raised a California beach boy in Southern California. But I grew up very differently than how I live now, in just perspectives, perceptions of things. And but I also realize there are different perceptions of us Californians here that aren't always accurate. There's the stereotype perception of Californians that they're all Hollywood. They're all beach and Baywatch and all this, and they're all liberal. And so I've had to understand how people perceive that, which for me is a good exercise in our conversation today, because all the places I go around the world, people think differently than us. And they have a variety of reasons as to why, because their culture is different. Their religious worldview is different than ours. You go to the Middle East in a highly Islamic area, it's going to be very different from here. And when I say here, I talk about the West, because in the West, though we have Judeo-Christian values, we're very secularized in our thinking, right? And we've grown up in public school systems who say God doesn't exist. Evolution is the truth, right? It's science. And so we've got this whole culture that likes to pretend there's a God partially, but really practically they don't. They want to act very secular. And then you go to the Middle East where their whole worldview is wrapped up in their religion called Islam. And everything they think, how they operate as families, as a community, all stems out of that worldview. And it's just very, very different, very strange for us.
Yeah. Essentially, it's important to understand how you're perceiving the people you're reaching out to and also how they're perceiving you.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that goes both directions and interacting and building relationships. So there's a couple areas that we're going to really kind of focus on today in helping us develop a understanding of why it's important to know the worldview, know the culture, and how to do that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I think just the awareness of what a worldview is and how cultures are different, and taking our pride and just leaving it in the box, right? And coming humble before others, knowing, here's what I know. No matter where I go, there's 8 billion people around the world. And here's what I know is true about every single one of them. They're all made in the image of God because the Bible says so, right? Which means they have value instilled into them by God himself. So I may not understand their culture. I may not understand their language, their religion, and their worldview and stuff, but I know they have value. God has placed value on them because he created them in his image. And the gospel is for them, right? I know that is true about every one of them. And the gospel is the answer for them. For all eternity, that's the answer. And that's what I need to bring to them. And so those facts and those truths are as true about me and you as it is about them. And so that keeps me humble, and that keeps me in a posture of compassion, a posture of wanting to learn about them, and a posture of humility towards them. Like, I don't have to be arrogant and tell them they're dumb because I don't understand their stuff and why they do the way they do. They reciprocally don't understand why we do things the way we do.
Yeah, that's great. So I think we've discussed and are looking into a little bit. It starts with being grounded in your spiritual walk. Yeah. And that's really got to be the basis, like you were kind of talking about. We've got to have that foundation that kind of stems all of our thoughts and directions towards the people we're in.
Yes. Yeah. It really, for me, it always starts in that Genesis 1 passage that created in the image of God. And so our culture, our media in our culture wants to point fingers at different folks, especially after 9/11, and say, especially Muslims and stuff, hey, they're the enemy. Politically, they're the enemy. And as Christians, we don't want to primarily think of them as the enemy. We have an enemy. His name is Satan. They are people who are made in the image of God, who have value, and who are in desperate need of the gospel primarily. And so that changes my perception about them. And when I get into that culture in the Middle East or in the Far East or wherever I'm at in the world, and I can see them in that light and see them as the Bible describes them, then it's much easier for me to not have hatred towards them, but the compassion of Christ towards them and want to offer them the greatest gift ever in the gospel.
One of a quote I picked up a long time ago was a leadership quote, and I've really discovered it applies to most situations you can put this phrase in, and it's be a student, not a critic. Yeah. And I think it's so easy, just call it like it is. There is an arrogance that a lot of times we have as Americans. And I think we are very proud of our values and our culture, but just because it's how we do it doesn't mean it's the right way to do it. I think, like you said, that humility is so important to go in and say, hey, I could be critical of everything, but let me step up and be a student. Let me just hear why and how this process comes about and why their approach to life situations are this method or
yeah. And it actually might make a little more sense. Once you hear them out and see their thinking process, it makes a little more sense in their content.
Yeah. All right. So just thinking through this a little bit, the practicality, though, of understanding the culture, understanding the worldview, got to start somewhere. So where does that start?
So if we're thinking about, hey, I'm going to go to a different culture and I'm going to take the gospel to a different people group around the world. Well, first off, we want to start with just a little bit of home research here, right? Get on the internet, go to a library, talk to some people, learn about that area, learn about that people group. What's their major religious worldview? You're not going to learn exhaustively about their culture and everything, even while you're on the ground. If you're there for a long time, you'll learn quite a bit. But if you're thinking short-term trip or whatever, just a basic understanding is going to suffice. But yeah, we start there with some research ahead of time. But then when you get on the ground, ask questions. Humbly ask questions. Use the questions to build the relationships, which is a key factor. If you want to really have an opportunity to share the gospel with somebody, even in the Middle East, or I've been in China and other places where it's illegal to share the gospel, but it's not illegal to answer questions. So if I come and start asking questions about them, they really have, what I've always found, they want to learn about us. So I'm going to get questions asked of me, and at that point I can freely share because I'm answering questions.
Yeah. Well, I can think back, again, a trip to Uganda I was on. I was having a conversation with one of our ministry partners there. Yeah. And the topic of finances came up, and he was talking about something that he struggled with financially. And we were in a season that we'd been through some difficult financial things that we were walking through. And he was like, I'm really glad to hear that. I didn't think Americans had financial issues. And so, yes, comparatively, we are wealthy beyond belief compared to their monetary situations. Right. But it built a bridge to him to say, hey, it may be different, but our struggles are universal for the most part. There's lessons to be learned through everything you go through.
That's right. I learned that, gosh, I've been traveling overseas for over 25 years now. And very early on, I came back with the realization, everywhere I go, people are people. We all have the same basic needs. Now, our cultures and worldviews offer up different answers and strategies to meet those needs. But really, people are people. And I think that reigns true because we have a God who made us all in his image.
So there's one last thing that we kind of discuss is probably the most critical thing to engage when you're trying to learn about a culture or worldview that's new to you. And that's just reaching out to people that have been immersed in that culture before.
Oh, yeah. That's an invaluable resource, right? If you really want to understand a culture and a worldview, find somebody who's from there, right? Or if you can find a missionary who lived there long term, or preferably even a native, though, who is from there and that's their home culture and stuff like that. That's where you build those relationships and go with a lot of questions and a very open heart and a listening ear. And if they're not a believer, you're going to be looking and praying, okay, how do I bridge what they're telling me to get to the gospel? And that's the thought process. And I've had some fascinating conversations over the years, just that started by me asking questions, trying to figure out, why do you guys do these things this way? Yeah.
All right. So wrapping this up, I'm going to put you on the spot. Yeah. I started off with my story about taking a picture of the bridge. Yeah. What's one odd cultural situation that has come up in your mind that's jumped out that you were just caught off guard by? It may not be something big, but what's something that you might could think of?
Boy, that's actually a tough question when I'm thinking about it, because I could totally relate to the no pictures, all this places. I think when, I lived in Egypt over 20 years ago, and during Ramadan, at the end of Ramadan, they have this Eid, this festival that mimics the Isaac and Abraham narrative in Genesis 22. But they say it's Ishmael. And so at the end of this thing, they're slaughtering sheep and goats. And so you're walking through Cairo, and there are goat legs and sheep legs everywhere. And, I watch them slaughter a sheep. sacrifice a sheep at the base of the building we lived in. And I mean, it gave me a great opportunity to ask, why do you do this? And then can I tell you the story from the Bible? But at the same time, I thought, where in the world am I? Like, I'm from California. I've never seen this before. It was very strange for me to witness. So.
That's good. I think I've learned too. I think when you first travel, it's really easy to be scared about the unknowns. But really, I've learned that you just got to embrace it's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely.
Lean
Flexibility.
into it. Yeah.
Yes.
And some of the funniest moments you'll experience will oftentimes be those weird cultural things you overcome. It's been a fun episode as we talk about culture and worldview. As always, thank you so much for tuning into this season of the Forward Podcast. We only have a few more episodes left, so make sure you're liking, subscribing, and sharing with anybody that you know that want to be more engaged in missions. Once again, if you have any questions, reach out to us by emailing us at info@mbchurch.com or by visiting our webpage at mbchurch.com. We'll see you next time on the Forward Podcast.